At the Top of the Stone Wall, an original story written and read by Dave Hawkins. Copyright 2018. Part 5. The night before had promised drama and excitement in gobs, which had never really happened. It just fizzled out when Rusty took Hupstead by the arm and, instead of pursuing the gaunt, shadowy stranger into the bush, had led them past the huge wild pear tree to a small hut just beyond. Of course, the lights were off and Rusty had lit a candle until the lights came on, which they didn't. So it was in a dark hut in a dark wood in which Hupstead spent his first night away from his own bed, his fluffy cat, and in the thick of an unknown adventure, in what had turned out to be a rather curious place, very foreign in feel and people to anything he had expected or been prepared for. After all, while on a stroll through a city park he knew well, he had just happened on a girl lying on the grass in a swoon. Curiously, just behind where she lay was a stone wall. Hupstead was sure there had never been a stone wall there before, but memory is a funny thing when you're just going through the motions of a walk in the local park and not really concentrating on details. Not knowing how or why the girl found herself there, Hupstead decided to scale the wall to see what the far side might hold. Now, apparently far away from home, it was the early dawn light that had woken him. The hut was wooden, sparse, strange, with no curtains on the windows. There were no decorations on the windowsill or at the bedside either. Hupstead smiled. Typical bachelor's fad, he said to himself. Hupstead Drabble lay back, hands behind his head, pondering his next move. Above his head, hanging from the neat wood-clad ceiling, a single bare light bulb on a single cord, looking forlorn and as though it should be adorned with a decorative lampshade. It's what I thought. Bachelors. No swoon ever set foot in this place. His thoughts were now fixed on the girl he had seen for such a brief time the day before, just before he had scaled the stone wall and found himself in this strange land. Swoon, as Hupstead had called her, for that was how he had found her, had been lying at the base of the stone wall. She'd looked beautiful, Hupstead had thought. Gorgeous, in fact, in that curled-up manner with long tousled honey hair half covering her face, such as is the normal thing that happens to a girl in a swoon. Or so Hupstead mused, his mind meandering romantically there and back. The somewhat egotistical, yet at the same time manly impulse of, I can help, I can save her, had definitely kicked in. Anyhow, at the top of the wall, after he had taken in the spectacle of the bustling waterfall, the resultant raging river torrent, the strange compact bell tower with the curled-up cherub poised in the middle and only a few paces in front of him, and the strangeness of the late afternoon sky, Hupstead had looked back down to check on Swoon, and she had gone, disappeared, leaving not a trace, no glass Cinderella slipper, no beautifully feminine scarf that may have pulled itself free as she rose to leave. It had all happened so fast, but she had left enough impression upon Hupstead Drabble to fire his imagination. Such is the instant nature of a man in these things that an encounter of barely more than a few seconds, and with a girl who was not even awake at the time, had set his heart aflutter. As he wondered over these recent events, the glow of the rising sun began to shift slowly off the ceiling and creep almost imperceptibly down the light cord. The shaft of morning light grew more brilliant as it descended. Hupstead waited with bated breath for it to reach and shine through the substantially large globe. Just as it touched, the lights came on. "There, told you they'd come on soon," Rusty's voice broke the silence from the room next door. "Monsoon," followed the immediate, inevitable, gruff-voiced echo. Hupstead was slightly disappointed, as he had wanted to see the effect the sun would have had as it spilled into and reflected in the glass of the globe. Too late now, so he straightened up and turned off the bed to put his shoes on. During breakfast, a typical bachelor breakfast, as Hupstead had mentally noted, he began to formulate his exit plan. True, Rusty and his identical twin had given Hupstead a bed for the night and now an early morning meal, But in the back of one's mind, one didn't know whether this was mere calm before a storm and personal danger of some description. Time to ponder his progress, and realizing he was still alive in a strange place with two unpredictable strangers had begun to ignite something in Hupstead Drabble. He might look like a banker on a weekend camp, but the fearless hero in him was just starting to awaken. "Dry toast and a hard-boiled egg go down well, don't you think?" asked Rusty, not really expecting an answer. "Me favourite," Blur's reply muffled by his full mouth. A stray crumb or two flew out with the breath of his words, just missing Hupstead's plate. I've had worse," said Hupstead, instantly realizing that while his own knife was still safely tucked in his own belt, the one Blur held looked dangerous enough, especially in the hands of one as unpredictable as Blur. "Worse?" Blur ejected a few more crumbs with this remark, more than with his first, and Hupstead thought that this might not be the best of signs. "Worse," said Rusty thoughtfully. "Worse can only be fresh hot toast with butter and a soft-boiled egg with cheese spread on top. And perhaps a hot cup of tea. That'd be no good at all." "Not at all," spat Blur. "One shudders at the mere mental picture of it," said Hupstead. The twins agreed. They chewed on noisily for a few more seconds. "The girl, you said—" "Ah, yes, the small man, I recall," said Rusty. "I'll tell you how to find him, but you must beware of Progue. He often lurks in these parts." Bad boy, said Blur. "Dastardly fellow, with evil plans aplenty in his pockets. All born, of course, in his heart, and quickly travelled from there to his scheming head. The small man will vouch it's the truth. You'll find him straight along this path. Veer not off it, and in less than half a day there you shall find him." "Find who? Progue?" "Bah!" grunted Blur distastefully. "The small man, hello!" Hupstead glanced at Blur for the reply. None came. Hupstead gestured apology with his hands. "Let me take my leave before the heat of the day strikes." After being assured that help came in to do the few washing up items, Rusty and Blur led Hupstead to the main path. They had changed from their dark red and blue combinations to bright orange and green coats, caps and boots. Rusty wore mostly orange, Blur mostly green. Hupstead so badly wanted to mention the Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest similarities, but feared the inevitable explanation and subsequent discussion and the time this might take. Instead, Hupstead broached the subject of the shadowy figure from the previous evening. "Who was the fellow who crossed our path last night?" The twins reacted as though struck by the news that their favourite uncle had just passed away. "No one in particular," said Rusty. Nobody, blurted Blur. "Will the small man know him?" asked Hupstead. Rusty shrugged. "I don't know." Blur, however, nodded. The stony silence after was Hupstead's sure sign that his time with this unusual pair was up. "Onwards, straight as a die," said Rusty. "If you run into Progue, you'll recognize his intentions straight off. Bad from the boots up. You'll hear it in his voice. You'll see it in his eye." "What does this fellow look like? A brute, big and broad, or short and portly?" This was met with awkward stares and silence. "Surely you can tell me. You've seen him." "Well, not exactly seen," said Rusty cautiously. "Not seen him? Have you heard him speak at least?" Hupstead asked. "Otherwise, how on earth do you know about this fellow?" "We have our intel, let's just say. Our sources." "We're informants." Had this been the first remark Hupstead had heard Blur utter, he would have been confused. However, after the few hours spent with this curious pair, he knew to take most of what Blur said at half face value. "Okay, no see, no hear, but you know all about him. Odd," Hupstead said. As Hupstead stepped forward to greet them, they turned on their heels as one and left. Not unkindly so, but all the same weirdly, thought Hupstead. He watched for a second or two, then turned himself and strode off. Long, lonely road to nowhere, or somewhere.